Well, it's so great to see so many of you on the Zoom. And I know how it is to spend hours and hours each day staring at a screen. So I promised to make this engaging. And I also promised to make plenty of room for your questions, because I think that's the fun part of this. Ed and I have been talking for some time now about how I could come and work with you all in person in Asia. And we keep being thwarted by this pesky little virus that it keeps getting in the way of our lives. So it's with great pleasure that I'm able to connect with you on Zoom through the magic of technology. And what I wanted to do with you today was to share a little bit about my story, and then also the insights that I've gathered along the way as I've developed an anti-bullying program, which I'm really grateful has been picked up by so many schools across the world as a really effective intervention for how you can become a bully-free school. And so that's the subject of today. And let me pull up the slideshow. And oops, sorry.
What you are about to witness.
Sorry about that. And let's back up here. Oh, that's the beginning of this. Okay, you should now be seeing a slideshow. So feel free to post comments in the chat if anything, if you got anything to say. This Power Zero, you might be wondering what that is. It's a non-profit, and it's a non-profit both in the UK and the US. And I started that because I was increasingly concerned about the phenomenon of online bullying, and more generally about what was happening to youth as they were going online. And I started that while I was running the No Bully program. And we're going to be talking about the No Bully program rather than Power Zero, but I'm happy to take any questions about that. I thought I would begin with my story, because I think it explains perhaps better than anything why I care about this subject so much. So when I was 12, I was sent to this school that you can see here, and it's one of England's prestigious schools. And my parents weren't that well off, but they managed to get me a scholarship there. And I went at the age of 12, and I was a couple of years younger than the other students. And at that age, as you can imagine, I was 12, they were 14 in my year, considerably smaller than them. And that began a story of fairly relentless bullying. They gave me this nickname, the Runt, because I was smaller than the other students. And they would take my possessions and scatter them around the schoolyard that you can see here. And there was a group of boys that would pick on me between classes and punch me in the stomach. That was so hard that I couldn't breathe, and I would fall to the ground gasping for breath. But I think the most painful part of that time was that I never heard a kind word. I never had a reassuring hand on my shoulder. And I survived those 4 years. And I think with bullying, you can go in a couple of different directions. You can start to believe what people say about you, which is generally that at some level you don't belong. You're not part of the human race, and you get excluded. Or you can hold on to a greater sense of humanity and want to do something about the violence that exists sadly in this world. And I went that route. So when I left university, I went to Oxford, and then I trained as a human rights barrister. I could never quite figure out where I cared so much about human rights, but I'm sure it's obvious to you all now listening to me. And I for quite a few years, I was on the board of Amnesty International in the UK. But somehow law didn't quite answer what I was wanting to do in the world. I couldn't achieve the positive impact in the world that I wanted. So I retrained as a psychotherapist working with children. And when you do that, they say, study something that's really, really personally interesting to you and write your dissertation on that. So I did mine on what's the effects of long-term effects of school bullying, what happens to students, young students, when they grow up. And I realized I was one of the lucky ones. So many people came through with stories of really violent bullying, and also started to paint this picture that they could never quite form relationships in their adult lives. They're still going through their adult lives with a sense of shame. I remember one of the people I talked to said that he felt always he had a sign on his back saying loser, and that everyone could see it. And that solidified in me a commitment to doing something about that, to making sure that this next generation at school doesn't have to endure the sorts of things that so many of us, frankly, had to put up with when we were at school. And that was the birth of the No Bully program, which I started in 2003. So it's almost 20 years old now. We were one of the earliest anti-bullying programs. And I want to share with you some of the insights along the way, because I think it might be helpful to you in your schools. So let me move this along here. If you look at my situation, which is really the situation of any young person who's been bullied, you can look at it through this lens of needs, because bullying gets in the way of some of the most fundamental needs that we all have. And there's a need that we all have for safety, and bullying gets in the way of that. Often it's physical. And I think probably more destructively than anything is the way that bullying attacks belonging. So my experience was of being bullied really because my family weren't as well off as the other students at this private school. And I think the most painful part for me, and the most destructive part for me, was just always feeling on the outside, always feeling on as an outsider, that I don't belong, that I didn't have value. And it's those two levels there, safety and belonging, that bullying really attacks. And that's why it causes so much damage. And if you think about bullying, sometimes it's physical, but sometimes it's not. But pretty much in all cases, it's about exclusion. It's about being on the outside. And it's quite fascinating to see the research on what happens to a person who is excluded. And they're starting to do fMRI scans now of people who are going through simulated social exclusion situations. And what they find is that the same parts of the brain light up in the person going through a social exclusion experiment as if they were going through some physical danger or physical threat. In other words, our nervous systems are wired for belonging. And if we are excluded, our whole nervous system, our whole psyche starts to rally against that as if we were physically in danger. So we're going to be talking about all types of bullying today. It's not just physical bullying. And we're going to come back quite often today to this very important need that all students have to belong. And you need to get those needs met, your need for safety, your need for belonging, before you can start to have a realistic sense of who you are in the world and feel good about who you are, which is often called self-esteem. And you need that in order to reach your full potential, either as an adult or as a student. So in other words, bullying, if it's happening at your schools, it's getting in the way of your students' ability to really flourish at the school and to reach their potential, not just in terms of their social and emotional development, but in terms also of their academic development. So thank you for being on this Zoom call. This is a really important subject. It's part of the whole of the education of the whole child at your school. Hoping that all makes sense. So let's look at what I discovered along this journey of starting the No Bully program. And roughly speaking, here are the insights that I've had along the way. This is what I call my insight map. And I'm going to explain to you each of these, and we're going to have a little bit of time on each of these, and then there'll be a nice bunch of time at the end, I hope, for your questions. We can start to explore what's happening at your school. But my encouragement for you is, as I talk about this at every point, for you, start to think about, how does this apply to my school? What's the lesson for me here? What's the takeaway for me here? And if it's not clear to you, those are the sorts of questions I'm going to welcome at the end. How can I apply these insights to making my school a school that is bully free? So the first insight I realized on this journey was that for every bullying incident that's reported at your school, there are roughly 8 more incidents that are occurring at your school. In other words, you're only seeing the tip of the iceberg. Students are very reluctant to report bullying. Most of it goes unseen. And part of your work, I think, if you're going to really create a bully-free school, is how do you actually change those numbers? How do you get students willing to seek help if they need it? So that it isn't just that you're seeing 10% or 20%, but you get to see more of it, and you can get to do more about it. And part of the answer to that is having a system in place that students feel safe with, that they trust. And we'll talk more about that later as well. So the question then becomes, how much bullying is going on at your school? How much are you seeing, and how much are the other people seeing? And to first get there, we need to understand what bullying is. And I'm very curious to hear your answers about, how does bullying happen? Bullying is a repeated thing, is targeting a less powerful student. And there are 4 major ways it happens. But let's just get very clear about how we define bullying. And more precisely, what are those 4 major forms that bullying takes? So we're a relatively small group, so feel free to take yourself off mute if you've got an answer here for how does bullying happen.
We see a lot of through exclusion.
Yes.
Right.
Which part of the world is your school?
South Korea.
Yeah. So in the early days, bullying was just seen as physical, which is clearly one of the forms of this. And then researchers realized that that's just one small way that it takes place. So you have physical bullying, and then a lot of it's verbal. But I think the most painful part actually is what's called relational bullying, what you named as exclusion. It tends to take place more amongst girls than amongst boys. By relational bullying, we're meaning indirect bullying that takes place. It's not face-to-face. It's more about gossip and rumors and certain students being excluded from cliques, from groups. Cliques is often associated with relational bullying. And what we've found in our work we've worked in quite a few schools in Asia, is that in cultures that value saving face and value harmony, a lot of the bullying takes place relationally. It's less in your face bullying. So those are 3 of the major ways that bullying happens, but there's also a 4th way. And I'm curious if anyone would like to suggest what that 4th way is. Well, I'll give you a clue. It's taken off in the last, I would say, 10 years. It's really taken off.
Like cyberbullying, then?
Yes. The 4th. So bullying, cyberbullying is a concerning phenomenon because when bullying goes online, first off, it starts to have a life of its own. It starts to have a drama of its own. So it's repeated very, very rapidly, often through posts. Someone posts a video of a student in the bathroom stalls, for instance. That post, everyone in the school suddenly watching it, and it can easily go viral. And then once it's gone viral, it's very hard to remove from platforms. We can talk about how you can work with social media companies and help the reporting to get it down, but it's difficult to do that. And what seems to happen is that, as we saw earlier, one of the worst components of bullying, the most damaging effects of bullying, is shame. And the ability of online to amplify bullying seems to exponentially amplify also the level of shame that students feel. So cyberbullying is a real problem. What we're also seeing is it's often the same students who are being bullied online as who are being bullied face-to-face at their schools. So there's a strong overlap. But if you're going to be addressing bullying, you need to be looking at all the ways that this happens. And so what I want you to do now, I'm hoping you all have a piece of paper, is I'm going to ask you a scaling question, if that's okay. And this is a scaling question you're going to answer privately. And the scale is 0 means not at all and 10 means a lot. And I want you to answer for each of those categories of bullying, how big a problem it is for your school. How big a problem is that type of bullying for your school? It's a very rough and ready measure, this. But take a moment just to go through each of those categories and just answer for yourself on a piece of paper. Scale of 1 to 10. How much of a problem is this for my school? And then we'll talk. Okay, so I'm very curious which one you scored the highest. So again, feel free to take yourself off mute and share which one you scored the highest of these for your school.
For me, I did verbal and relational. My students are 3rd grade, so not so much interaction with computers.
Yeah.
One student in particular who has done some things on the internet, but I think the other 2 in the middle would probably be the highest on my scale.
And could I ask what numbers you gave them?
I said like 8.
Okay, both at 8.
Yeah.
And are you seeing that the girls do more relational bullying, or is?
Well, we had to have a workshop for our girls in particular, about friendship groups and stuff. We found that grade 3 seems to be a very transitional year, where
Yes.
Groups and things start to change because school gets a little bit harder as well. So when school gets harder and academics are harder, then you also start to have exclusion based on that, where students are like, oh, you're not smart, and people are being picked on for for those types of reasons as well. My school is in Asia. I teach at a Jewish school as well. So there's a lot of other factors that get put into that, because these students see each other outside of school a lot as well. So everything is interconnected, and yeah, it can become very complicated.
Well, I love that you are, I love that you are teaching friendship groups, and what you're describing is very typical for that age group of girls. They seem to, I mean, this is a very broad statement here, but they seem to have more relational intelligence than boys, which for better or for worse means that they tend more to cliques. And sadly, at that age group, seem to experiment with exclusion quite a lot. So good on you for starting friendship groups. Anyone else would like to share? What's your of these, which is the biggest challenge? Feel free to unmute yourself.
So for my school, Thailand, I rated relational as the highest as well. And which is number 7.
Mm.
It's more of like it's grade 4, and they do a lot of gossip and exclusion, but not much of a verbal on and on. It's usually like exclusion, more of that. And then second one would be because we really started using Google Chat with working on projects and a
Yeah.
lot of things like that. So we're starting to see a lot of like not a lot, but more of like bullying within the Google Chat. So I rated that as the second one. So the first one is relational, second is cyberbullying.
And could I ask you what scores you gave each of those?
Sorry.
What scores, what
Okay.
numbers did
Oh, okay. Relational is about a 7, and then
Yeah.
cyberbullying is about 5.
Okay.
Verbal, not so much, because they don't, in my school, they don't really head on like say, usually it's more of the relational type of bullying.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'm glad you're on this call because your number, in some extent, because it's about grading your own problem, is a very rough and ready assessment of what's troubling you, and clearly you're troubled. So thank you for being concerned about this. Every school suffers from bullying. The numbers across the world are quite staggering. So this is a chart put out by UNICEF. Ignore the grey countries where they just didn't have the data. They extracted this data from some quite wide-ranging surveys they do of 13 to 15-year-olds, asking a whole battery of questions around alcohol use and drug use and how safe they feel more generally and at school. And these are the answers that they got. With the lighter yellow countries like the US and broadly China being 20 to 30%. But this darker yellow is 31 to 40%, and then the red countries are even higher than that. A lot of those countries where it's red are also countries where there's quite extreme physical punishment, physical corporal punishments, both at schools and in the homes quite often, which seems to contribute to even more bullying. But pretty much every school has some level of bullying. In the independent schools that we work with, there's much less physical bullying, but it seems to take the form of verbal and relational bullying much more, I think. I've seen it in Asian schools as often the number one problem. But the takeaway from this first insight is take the time to assess what types of bullying you have at your school. When we work with schools, we do this exercise with the teachers. It's a very rough and ready measure, but it does start to show, okay, it's mainly online bullying, cyberbullying. We need to therefore craft our program, our response around online. How do you ensure that the online culture that the students are engaging in is bully free? It's an important first step. Oftentimes when we work with schools, we also help them do a whole culture survey, which includes the questions around bullying, but also beyond that, because it's important to get student perspective too. The second major insight I got from running the No Bully program in schools was bullying is so often about differences. So students who are less than and more than in a particular dimension. And you heard earlier that I was bullied because of really socioeconomic status. But let's have a look at what are the main reasons that students are targeted at your schools. And again, love to hear from you. So feel free to come off mute and tell me what you're noticing.
One thing that I've noticed about bullying is that students who have behavioral, who may be struggling with behavioral issues,
Yeah.
They can be more bullied than others. Like those who may be perceived, maybe not diagnosed like with ADHD, or they are maybe in lower academic, may seem to be struggling, or are just out of the norm, they seem to be the ones who are targeted more or struggle with the exclusion.
That's again, sadly, very common. And so broadly speaking, disabilities and behavioral disabilities are 2 to 3 times more likely to be bullied. What else are you seeing? What are the differences that are being targeted at your schools? The most common one is across the world is remains size and appearance, and so that kind of moves into your skin color, but also your body size. And I know from many of the Asian schools I've been talking to, there's quite often a focus amongst the girls on body size and weight, which sadly is increasingly targeted. But it's then the one you've just mentioned. It's a pretty chilling list here, because you can start to, from the surveys, you can start to kind of assess the reasons that the students are being bullied and to correlate them with the frequency of bullying. So when we go with school, when we work with schools, we'll often do an exercise with the teachers as part of our teacher training called the ins and the outs exercise. We don't have time to do it now, but I just wanted to kind of throw it up there as an example, which you could easily do with your teachers, which is what we call the ins and the outs map. And then in the ins and the outs map, you start to ask, well, which students are the popular students in our school and why? And then in parallel with that, you start to say which students are being left out, who are the excluded students, and what seem to be the reasons for that. And then instead of actually writing the names of the students in this chart, you write the characteristics. And you can learn so much from this exercise because you start to see, okay, these are the patternings at our school. And it's no surprise that when you've gone through this exercise, the outs are also the outs that probably your local community or the society that you're working in also tends to value you less. That these tend to be the groups that are marginalized more. But what this means is that when you're addressing bullying, you also need to be looking at how successful are you at being an inclusive school? Because bullying is so much about exclusion and differences. You need to be going in the opposite direction. And we're working with an international school right now in China, where one of the challenges is they're a very multicultural school. And I think probably a lot of you have that aspect to your school. And it's a blessing because you with diversity comes actually much greater learning for your students. But also you have to take care to make sure that there's not fragmentation, that you don't get certain groups in the school being excluded just because they are from a particular race, particular group. It's a strong reminder to this. At the end of the day, your success at the school depends upon this really key question of how successfully inclusive are we? The next insight I want to share with you is something I discovered fairly early on running the No Bully program, is that bullying is a systemic problem. So it's easy, and I think the first level of response is to, when you have a bullying incident, to focus on the individual students and to focus in particular on the bullying students and to see their behavioral challenges, their family challenges perhaps that are going on in the background, and try to fix the bullying situation by addressing them. And that's part of the answer. But the better thinking now around bullying is seeing that bullying takes place in a context. And this chart is borrowed from a really clear thinking sociologist in the States called Yuri Brunnenfrenner, who influenced a lot of educational policy in the States. And he created this idea of students being nested within different systems or circles of influence, so that for any bullying situation, and the bullying's in the middle of this chart here, you have to look at what's going on with the bystanders and how come the students are standing by doing nothing. And you have to look at how the teachers are interacting with the students, and whether, for instance, they're using sarcasm as a form of classroom discipline, or whether they are laughing and going along with some of the comments that are being made. At my school in England that I showed you the slide of earlier, the administrators saw bullying as a rite of passage. They thought it would make students stronger. And that was the old English way of raising children to be tough. It's a terrible way of making children tough. Don't try it at your school. But if you have administrators who have that belief, obviously they're not going to intervene. And then you may have parents who, I remember one of the independent schools we worked with, the parents were split into two groups. There was the country club parents, and there were the other parents. And the school was really struggling with how divided I think it was their 5th grade class was. And as they looked at that, they realized that the popular girls in that class all belonged to the country club parents. And the country club parents never invited the other students to their schools. So they have the right to do that, of course, but that division was being reflected in how inclusive their school was. And in their case, their school was not an inclusive school. I'd been into schools where the parents were vitriolic in their use of gossip with other parents. And unsurprisingly, the school was also filled with division and gossip. So the parent culture absolutely affects the day-to-day running of the school. We now have online culture, and so your students are being affected by the sort of culture that they're experiencing on Xbox, the sort of culture they're experiencing on TikTok. And beyond that, there's the community values of your area and societal values of your whole country. So for any bullying situation, you need to be thinking in these terms. And I've been working with Ed, and any moment now, you will see an article from me talking about how you can use this chart to analyze any bullying situation in your school. So it can work both for individual situations to help you widen your lens, and this is a great map for you in terms of your whole school, because if bullying is taking place at any level, and some of you are reporting quite significant numbers, you need to be taking this wider lens. You need to be taking what's called a systemic approach. And a systemic approach, it doesn't mean you ignore the individual students, and it doesn't mean that you ignore what's going on with them in their own lives. It's a both and response. Yes, you need to look at the individual students, and also you need to look at the systemic influences at your school.
Nicholas, I have a question.
Yeah. Tell me.
The question I have is, in this diagram that you have, is, you have the target in the middle and then these outer circles. Is that necessarily the level? Like, looking at the bystanders are the most, closest to the bullying. Then you've got the teachers, the administrators, and the parents. Is that kind of a leveled, or is it just, because I feel like this leveling out could be different, in different situations.
Absolutely, very good question. So I had to diagram it somehow.
Right.
And, so concentric circles seem to make sense, but no, all of these could have different valences depending upon your situation. So don't be too concerned about which is more important or less important, because that's an open question for you.
Thank you.
Yeah, so thank you. So good question. Any other questions? I love questions. And I want you to learn from this. So the insight here is that bullying is a systemic problem. And that's useful because in terms of then of remedies, the old adage is systemic problems require systemic solutions. And in terms of your schools, that means looking at your school culture. Culture is another way to talk about the systems that the previous questioner asked about. So the question then is, how do you do that? How do visionary schools create culture change? How do they lead culture change at their school? And broadly speaking, there are 4 essential components to leading culture change. And the beginning point, the first part of this, is social vision. The first part of this is getting really clear how you want everyone in your school community to treat each other. And because we're talking about culture, it's important to think about your school community as including all the stakeholders. So it includes the parents, it includes the janitors, it includes the bus drivers, along with the teachers and the parents. It's a broad, you've got to take a fairly broad view of what your community is. And there's an important process of getting clear around this fundamental question: how do we want to treat each other? What are our school values? And in saying that, I take a lot of reinforcement from John Cotter, who was a brilliant professor at Harvard, and he did an analysis of organizations broadly, not just schools. And what he said in his analysis around how do you create change and how do you create a change of culture was that organizations too quickly rush to a solution. They don't take the time to get clear what their vision is. It's really important to have that clarity of vision. And that process in itself motivates people to go, yeah, we do have values. And yes, I was part of this process and I recognize that. And I want to make sure that our school really lives by those values, because I see that as the bedrock of a better community, a better place, a place where learning can really take off. So that's number one. And we're going to talk about that in a second. I'm going to lead you through an exercise around that. You need to reinforce that with an anti-bullying policy. And I got a question for you all, which is this: what makes a good policy? What makes a good policy?
Hi, I'm Roxanne. I'm from Vietnam. I would say a good policy is one that people are aware of and it's in practice, and they understand the why behind it. And the kids are familiar with it as well. Maybe not all the details, but what it is and what it means if it applies to them.
Yeah, beautifully put. So it's got to be used.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely, it's got to be used. It's got to be relevant. It's got to explain the why. It's got to show why you care about it. Why should people follow this policy? And what we found is, if you get a really clear social vision, all of these are linked on this chart. If you get a really clear social vision, you begin your anti-bullying policy with that. You say, you state whatever it is. At our school, we are an oasis of peace, which was one of the vision statements that a school we work with came up with. We are an oasis of peace. And for that reason, we do not accept any bullying at our school. It gets in the way of our social vision. That's the why. And then the policy has to lay out very clearly what everyone does. So clearly you don't want them to bully in the first place, but what should everyone do if there is a bullying situation? What do parents do? What do teachers do? What do students do? With very clear reporting lines mapped out and a very clear response system mapped out, which is the bottom quadrant here. So you also need, hopefully you're going to follow this process and you're going to have less bullying at your school, but you and I know that the reality is you're going to have students coming into school with their own challenges, their own difficulties. They're going to try the power plays out that are the heart of bullying. you need to have a very clear system for how you respond, and that system needs to be effective. And we'll talk later about that, but there's different choices about, do you use consequences, or is there more of a restorative approach that you can use? Which is most effective? You need to make a decision there. And then you need to very clearly state in your anti-bullying policy how that bullying response system is activated in any one situation. And then you also need to be teaching students the skills to replace bullying behaviors, to replace the power plays that they are engaged in right now. And we in the No Bully program highly recommend social emotional learning. Social emotional learning is a tool that not only increases your academic learning on average by 11 to 15%. Did you realize it was that high? That's from a meta study that was done of about 400,000, I think it was 300,000 students. And they found that the average student in the elementary primary level that had gone through a social emotional learning program, their academic results improved by 11 to 18%. So that's incredible of itself. And we love social emotional learning because the average student who goes through a social emotional learning program, as you would expect, builds their social and emotional competencies, suffers from much less of the mental health challenges that so many students suffer from, and exhibits much less victimization and aggressive behaviors that are the root of bullying. So it's a strong antidote to bullying, but it also reinforces your school as a really powerful place of learning. So you need all of these in place if you're going to successfully lead culture change at your school. And if you did all of those, you would, I promise you, see significant changes for the better at your school. And I wanted to take a moment just to show you a little bit about how you might craft a social vision statement. Hoping you're all on for that. So all you'll need from this is a piece of paper or something you can write on in just a second. So does everyone have a piece of paper, or do you need to go and get one? Piece of paper and a pen. You need to get one, let us know now. If not, I'm assuming you've got it. Okay, I'm going to lead you through a visioning exercise. So for a moment, you can put your pen down, and I'm going to lead you through this visualization process. And I'm going to lead you through what's called the miracle question. And the miracle question is asked not because I'm promising you a miracle, but because sometimes when we think about change that we really want, when we start to think about the miracle that we really want, it really puts us in touch with what our hearts long for. So as you sit here, feel the seat underneath you. Let that be a reminder to come back to you. Notice your breathing. And let that be a reminder to come back to you. Feel it going in through your mouth or your nose and out. And take a moment just to drop down a little bit inside of you. So I'm going to ask you now the miracle question. So imagine that when you go to sleep tonight, a miracle occurs. So that when you wake up tomorrow, the sorts of problem behaviors that we've been talking about today are a thing of the past. And I want you to visualize arriving at school, your school, and something is radically different. You notice it from the get-go. As parents drop their students off at school, maybe you greet your students, something's really different. They're behaving, they're treating each other in the way that you've always longed for, a way free from bullying. And now classes start for the day. Perhaps you're the fly on the wall in a classroom in your school. And the way that the class is happening is how you've always longed for it to happen. Students are treating each other in the class, and the teachers treating the students in the class in the way that you've always hoped for. Take a moment to look around and see that. And then it comes to recess. And you look out at recess. And again, this is different. Students are treating each other differently. It's the way you've always hoped that they would treat each other, and it's happened. Take a moment to see that. What does that look like? And you take a moment now to go into your staff room, your teacher room. It's recess. And the other teachers are there. And they are treating each other in a way that's different, in a way that you always wanted to. And they're treating you differently. And you're interacting differently with them. See that. What does that look like? What does that feel like? And now it comes to the end of the day and students are leaving. And you have an interaction with a parent. Maybe they come to your office. Maybe they are in your classroom. And that interaction is different too. There's a qualitative difference in how the parent is treating you and how you're treating the parent. This also is how you've longed for it to be. Take a moment to see that. And now it comes to the end of this very different school culture that you're in, and you leave to go home. Take a moment just to check in with yourself. How does this feel? How does it feel now being in this school community? What stands out at a feeling level? And what I want you to do now is to take a moment to write down on your piece of paper, this is just for your own personal use. What stood out? What was different? Take maybe three or 4 minutes to do this. Very important part of this, just to record what stood out, what was different. Just take one more minute. Okay, hopefully that was enough time for all of you to record some insights. And what I want to do now is to put you into some breakout rooms, and you have 5 minutes. Enjoy the randomness of this encounter. And it's a chance to share with a colleague what stood out for you. What were the most exciting parts of what you visualized for your school? And Ed, I'm going to ask you a quick question, which is, how many people are there on this call? It looks like about 24, because I think I need 12 breakout rooms, but Ed, help me out here. You on the call?
There are now 18, but that's including you and me.
Okay.
16 people.
16 people. Okay, we're going to do 8 breakout rooms. Okay, so you have 5 minutes. That all makes sense. You have 5 minutes. You're going to share with your partner what stood out in terms of your vision. What was the most exciting part for you of what you saw? Let's just see if that works. That looks good. Okay, so enjoy, and I'll call you back in roughly 5 minutes time. Amazing. Here we are connecting from all around Asia. It's incredible. And I often find that there's almost, I don't want to get too mystical about it, there's almost a magical quality of these breakout rooms that you end up with the person you're meant to be with, and it always seems to lead to some really fascinating conversations. So I'm really interested. What stood out for you? What's the most burning part, the exciting part of the vision that you came up with as you visualized a bully-free school community? Anyone want to start? Roxanne, I think you should start because
Okay. I had a good one, but I really like the one Marie's shared. Do you mind if I share it? Okay. So she was saying that, in terms of walking into a classroom and just seeing kids just group up, like maybe even on their own, where there's no issues and no concerns about who's working with who. I don't want to work with that person. And I was thinking, I agree, like how amazing would it be if the teacher said, all right, we need to form groups of 3 for this project. And kids were like, okay, well, hey, we haven't worked together for a while. Do you want to work together this time? And if people were interested in and open and saw the value of working with different people at different times, that would be a beautiful thing and different than what we currently see in most cases.
Thank you. There's a beautiful inclusiveness and openness that you're visualizing. Anyone else want to share? What really stood out for you as you visioned a different school culture?
Nicholas, I
Hi, Tessa.
perhaps did not do this entirely correct, but I mean, it would be phenomenal if that existed. But I think I had a really tough time because of the times that we're living in currently. So for me, the way I see it, when we have like peace in the world and when we're settled and like we don't have a pandemic going on and all of these types of things, then that will potentially affect our schools and our children.
Mm.
And so trying to visualize that was a bit of a struggle for me. And so if I can't see it, I don't blame children for not being able to see it.
Yeah, these are
So-
extraordinarily rough times. So I
Yeah.
totally understand. It's a stretch to do this exercise and to envision essentially a culture of peace.
I mean, having said that, we do well-being and mindfulness and growth mindset and all those things within our school. We have set an allocated time in the mornings 2 times a week, so that we understand that that is important to give students the tools to be able to cope with what's going on, and whether those be tools of how to work cooperatively with others, or how to self-regulate, or how to understand the world in which we live in. I think that those are important things, but also as teachers, we have to remember to do those for ourselves as well.
And it reminds me of the bullseye chart that I showed you earlier, where you saw those concentric circles of influence. Yeah, and right now those exterior circles of influence are highly impactful on our schools because there's so much activation and violence going on in the outer rings of that. Remember that bullseye chart? So absolutely, I completely understand your schools being affected by this, and at the same time, I want to encourage you to vision the impossible. And I want to share a story with you, and it's a story from a school probably in a rougher place than probably any of your schools are, which is a school in Oakland, California, which I worked in many years ago. And it was a Catholic school there, and the students would go home to gunshots on the street. Quite often someone would be shot dead on their street. They would hear gunshots at night, drug deals at the corner of the street. And the school said, you know what, we are living in a really rough time. This is a really rough neighborhood of Oakland. And for those of you who don't know the California that well, Oakland is almost synonymous with violence, sadly. And we want to really send the message back that when someone crosses the threshold of our school, they're entering a different world. And that was the school that came up with their vision statement, we are an oasis of peace. They did that, it's a very nice metaphor. They did that because they wanted to say, we recognize more than ever that our students need a different experience when they come to school. And so we're going to set ourselves apart and say at our school, as soon as you cross the threshold, all of those behaviors on the outside world and the troubles in the outside world, we want you to leave those behind. And it takes courage, I think, to vision in the face of the brutality that's around us right now. But I so encourage you to do this exercise, and you'll discover as you do that, these senses of this can never happen. But then you start to analyze, okay, what are my actual objections? And you start to write them out. And you start to analyze how much of those are really limiting beliefs, or how much of those are actual obstacles? And if they are actual external obstacles, what plans can you make to address those? Anybody else want to share their vision of how things could be different?
Nicholas, I would like to. One of the things that I noticed was the noticing that students and teachers and parents, that we were noticing others. We saw others. We weren't looking into ourselves. How do I help someone else? How do I welcome someone else? Looking at someone, seeing their faces, not looking down. Even if you're an individual, that you're okay, you're noticed as who you are and you're respected for that. So it's just beyond oneself, that just looking out.
That's a beautiful description, really, of compassion. Or empathy, the ability to step in the shoes of others and see things from their perspective. Karen Armstrong, who was used to be a Catholic nun, and then got a really significant award. I think it's from TED, actually, TED Talks, for the TED Talk she gave. Wrote a whole book on compassion as a value that's shared by nearly all cultures around the world, and has this wonderful phrase about children dethroning themselves from the center of their universe. Children dethroning themselves from the center of their universe. And of course, childhood is very much a time when you do put yourself at the center of your universe. But there's this other direction that you so beautifully articulated there. So good on you. That's a beautiful vision. So here you all are working with me at EACOS on your vision. Why is it not a good idea now to go back to your school after the session and say, I had this wonderful EACOS session with Nicholas Carlisle, this great workshop, and I now know the values of our school, and I'm going to tell them to you. Why is that not a good idea?
I think anytime you do this kind of thing, to be effective, like you've kind of been saying, you really want it to be a collaboration across all of your divisions, like horizontally, vertically, your parents, your administrators, your teachers, your students. And so it should be a conversation that you have together to kind of get to where you need to be so that everybody's on the same page. And that way it'll be an effective policy that, like you said, everybody understands, and they're all working together with the same kind of goal and mission and motivation behind that. So to just go in and tell everybody what they're going to do, that kind of goes against the objective, right? Long term.
Exactly. Thank you. Yeah, this needs to come from your school. It needs to come from all parts of your school. And when we work with schools bring our bullying prevention program to schools, this is the first order of business. And we do this exercise with the leadership team. And then we give them the template for doing this with the parents, to do it. And often you do it in different groups of parents. You can spread it out over some coffee evenings. Give them the template to do this with all the teachers and all the staff, and including the back office staff too. And you start to get these beautiful statements from people. And there's often a kind of consensus around some very particular values that your school has. And the challenge is to fearlessly say what those are, to see what the themes are, and to say it in 7 words or less. Because if it's anything longer, it sends people to sleep. You need to have a vision statement. You can also call it a value statement that's short. So it becomes a statement that you can use time and again. So when you're disciplining a student, you can say, the reason you're in my office is because we are an oasis of peace, or whatever your vision statement is. Or when you're talking to parents and you say, I know you're frustrated that this other child's bullying your child, but the way that you're talking to these other parents about it isn't helping, because we are an oasis of peace. You keep bringing it back to your vision statement. And each of you will have a unique vision statement for your school. Does that make sense? So you do this exercise, and we've done this exercise now, and I encourage you to do it with all of your school community. Let's get this slideshow back up again. And with that social vision in place, you can start to head up your anti-bullying policy with your social vision. Hopefully you put it on a poster somewhere very visible, maybe in the school office. It starts to become something that's unique about your school, that's distinguishing about your school. In a very beautiful way, it becomes part of the branding of your school, what your values are. Ideally, you're teaching social emotional learning. We talked about that earlier. And then you need in place a bullying response system for the times when you still have bullying. And so you're up against a choice point, which I think schools have struggled with for a very long time. And when I started the No Bully program in 2003, most schools answered this question about their bullying response system by saying, well, it's consequences. We have zero tolerance. We go in hard, and we'll punish students who are bullying. We do not accept bullying in any form. And it was very understandable where they were coming from. There's an extraordinary amount of pain and frustration about student bullying, and they wanted it to stop. And I think that system of consequences is long being used by schools, and it's hard to not use it for everything. But the problem when you use that with bullying is that, first off, it seems to lead to retaliation against the target. In this Oakland school I was talking about, they had this phrase, stitches are for snitches. But there was a perception that you would never tell the school if you were being bullied. And part of the reason for that is that the schools are using punishment, and that drove bullying underground, which meant that bullying is not reported. But also what the research is showing that is that if you want to change behavior, and you're talking now about the bullying students, if you want to change their behavior, punishment is a really lousy way to change behavior. So what we started to experiment with at No Bully was let's take punishment out of the equation. And instead of punishment, when there's a bullying situation, we will bring the bullying students together with 3 or 4 of the pro-social students in that particular class or grade. And we will say to them, no one's in trouble, which is another way of saying this is not a punishment situation. And it's still, I laugh on the inside when I'm leading students to a solution team, because they always say, why are we here? Have we done something wrong? Why are we all meeting in this special room? Are we in trouble? So the first thing you always say is, we're not in trouble. And then you tell them you've been specially chosen because you've got the power to solve a situation. So you can see, you start to put them, you give them a sense of agency and a sense of being able to do good in the world. You've got the power to solve a situation. One of your peers has bravely come to talk to me, and they've told me that they're suffering. And here's what's going on for them. Tamara dreads coming to school. Sunday night is the worst night of the week for her, because she knows that on Monday morning when she comes back to school, people are going to, the other students, whenever she speaks in class, they laugh, they make fun of her grades, and they constantly talk to her about her size and why she's eating so much and why does she have such a fat face. And it's got to the point now where some days she just doesn't want to be alive. And we've all had bad days. Some of us have bad weeks. She's having a bad life. And on the inside, she just feels terrible about herself. She feels so lonely and so unhappy. So you can see there that what we're doing is walking the students into the shoes, as we just talked about, into the shoes of that suffering student. And there's often a little bit of pushback. Well, Tamara does this and Tamara does that. And you say, well, okay, that's good feedback for Tamara, but let's keep you on track. What can you do, or what can you stop doing to solve this situation? And one by one, if you stay firm, students come up with suggestions and you say, well, those are great suggestions. And you are the solution team. You're the team we brought together to solve this situation. And we're going to meet again in 1 week's time. And good luck with carrying out all your suggestions. Support each other in doing this because you're a team around this. And we're going to meet in 1 week's time to see how it's gone. That intervention, which is called Solution Team, solves 90% of cases of bullying, which is incredible. And I say that on the back of our continuing research into solution teams. And we've submitted and been part of peer-reviewed journals as we analyze and look at this data. A bullying response system like that, which is non-punitive, is, I would say, pretty much essential if you're going to create a bully-free culture. And if we had more time, Ed and I were talking about it today, if we had more time, I would show you our training film, but it's a little bit too long to squeeze into today. And so I thought it's better to just tell you about it. And then we got a little bit of time at the end for the questions. So just to wrap up, how we do it in the No Bully program, and you may have your own way of doing this. What we help schools implement is a system which is really kind of response to, it's a systemic response to the systemic problem of bullying. And the foundation is building an inclusive school culture. We talked about that today. So you have to lead culture change. And the culture change has to be one where belonging is valued, because as you've seen, bullying is really the opposite of belonging. All your staff need to learn how to interrupt the starting points, pre-bullying, the pre-aggression, the little comments. There needs to be a very rigorous commitment by everyone on the campus to not let those happen. The minor acts of exclusion that you talked about, as you say to students, form a project and they say, I'm not going to work with her. That is pre-bullying. If it's repeated, it becomes bullying. Even that needs to be interrupted. No, at this school, everyone belongs, or whatever your vision statement is. You need to have that bullying response system for the more ongoing, complicated situations of bullying, so that when a parent comes to talk to you, you can say, yeah, we've got the system in place and we've written it up in our anti-bullying policy. And this is how it works, and we're going to follow it here. We recommend Solution Team because it probably is the most effective way out there. But whatever you choose, make sure that it has a restorative quality to it. And then sometimes you need to be ready for that problem grade, that problem class. Some of you were talking about your third grade there, where there is a kind of exclusion has become a norm. And so you have to do a school-wide, a classroom-wide initiative. And I love your friendship groups as an intervention there, where you build up the empathy of students. So that's the No Bully system. You can find out more about us and our program at nobully.org. But I want to make sure there's lots of time for questions. That's my email address if you want to reach out to me. But now over to you for any questions or any responses.
I have a clarifying question I'm hoping to ask.
Go ahead, Roxanne.
Yeah, about your solutions team. I love that. That's really great. Yeah, I love empowering the students that way. I wasn't sure. I understand that you pulled together some pro-social students to do this. Is the person who bullied and the person who was bullied already in the room? Are they also in the room?
Very good question. So for the solution team, the premise of it, first off, is that it's too stressful for the target of bullying to be there. So the best practice is not to include them in that. But also, the magic of Solution Team is it goes against that code of silence. So stitches of a snitches is the old code of silence, yeah? Okay. So it's saying, we can talk about bullying. This is not a punishment situation. Don't need to worry about that, but we can talk about bullying. And yes, the bullying students in the room, you don't name them, you don't call them out by name, but you just say, Tamara is being bullied, and these are the sorts of things that are happening to her. And that's quite a hurdle for most educators to get across. They go, wow, we're actually going to talk about bullying with a bullying student in the room. Mm-hmm. But the miracle of this is as you start to do that, the other students feel empowered to say, yeah, I got a solution to suggest. And the power of that bullying student, because it's all about power, starts to slip away as the other students say, oh, I can do this. I could shoot some basketball with him, or I could ask her out onto a play date. The power of the bullying student starts to slip away. And I remember one solution team I ran where the bullying student put his hand up and said, yeah, I could ask the other students to cut it out. And I was just, my jaw just dropped. Hopefully he didn't see my jaw dropping, but my jaw dropped and I thought, wow, is he actually going to do it? And he really did. And afterwards we talked to him and said, so well, that's so wonderful what you did. And what helped you say that? And he said, well, I was tired of being seen as the bully. And actually I wanted a break from that role. And thank you, you actually gave me a way out, which was mind-blowing, but it happened.
Mhm. Thank you for that. I when you first explained it, I had this vision of my head of 3 kids being on the pro-social committee, but now when you speak, it sounds like you might be in an advisory or in the classroom with the kids.
The solution team is ad hoc. You run it for one particular situation only. It's not a permanent solution team. So in your 5th grade, you've got a problem, you'll have a solution team of fifth graders. 3rd grade, going to be a solution team of 3rd graders. And they just meet 3 times.
Okay.
There's that first meeting and 2 follow-up meetings. And what the research is showing that even 3 months later, the bullying has stopped.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Any other questions or thoughts? How did this make sense? How's this landing?
Nicholas, I have a question about working with parents and how maybe some ideas or just some thoughts that when parents are heavily involved as part of the bullying situation. You had mentioned a story when you were sharing about talking with parents and how, their sharing with one another was not helping the situation. I was wondering, what are some ideas and things, advice you might have?
Well, I could talk for hours about parents who are both your biggest allies, but also can be so challenging. I think you kind of started to name the great solution there, which is you have to have the courage to say to parents, we realize that you're really concerned about the well-being of your child and the children in this class, but the way that you're speaking about this is actually not helping us at school. So you actually you need to have the courage to name that. So I don't know the particular situation you're dealing with, but some of the schools, when they've had a problem grade or a problem class, have brought all the parents together around that situation. And then the leading point for that conversation is your social vision. So that's why your values become your best friend. If you've got really clear values, you can say, our school really values compassion. And this is, and you frame it as a sort of learning process rather than a sort of fault process. Students are part of the sort of learning growth curve for students is to understand compassion and to dethrone themselves from the center of their world. And this is a wonderful opportunity for that. So you speak up the value of compassion, and you say, and the best way for them to learn them is, for instance, that we run a solution team. Or the best way to learn this is if us parents stop commenting on the other students or kind of putting pressure on the other student to leave the school or the family to be reprimanded. Thank
you.
But we feel free to reach out to me privately about this too, because there's often complexity here that is hard to talk about in a public space.
I have another question related to that. Yeah, I'm also my challenge is to working with parents, and I noticed that so many parents overuse the term like bullying, like every single time, like even one sarcasm or one like name calling. My child get bullied, and then I really want to provide the really good definition of what the bullying is. So
So I know it's a really basic question, but then is there any like the definition, like what the bullying is? Instead, I mean,
Yes.
like you suggest like 4 categories, but then like more the fundamental definition of it.
Yeah, no, it's a very good question. And when we help schools write their anti-bullying policy or anti-bullying protocol, and we put a paragraph in there explaining the difference between conflict and bullying. And what you're talking about is really conflict. Is when it's one-off, when there's not that power differential that we kind of named earlier. It's conflict. And parents, when we run workshops for parents, we often spend a lot of time looking at, sometimes it's just a conflict situation. If it's a conflict situation, students need to learn to talk it through. And ideally, you kind of have a protocol that you teach students in, or even walk students through around how they deal with conflict. And you say to parents, you need to understand this too, and this is something you can use at home. This is what we're going to be using with the students. Unless it's actual bullying, it's repeated situation, we're going to help them talk it through.
Okay, thank you.
Of course. Ed, do we have time for one more question before we wrap up?
Yeah, I'm going to turn off the recording now, I think, and then if people want to stay and ask questions, that's fine. I'm just afraid we're going to run out of space. You stop dead in the middle of a sentence. So let me just close the recording by saying thank you for all of you who have attended, and to Nicholas. There's obviously much more that needs to be done and discussed and shared, but this was a great first opportunity, and all of you who are here tonight will receive a copy of the next issue of the IRCOS Journal, which has Nicholas's article in it, and hopefully we'll be able to be with him in person somewhere in the near future. But let me turn off the recording now, and then you continue to take any questions that you get. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.